and welcome everybody. I'm going to be slightly quiet today because I'm out in a public area and I'm trying not to disturb my neighbors. So I'll be a light-handed moderator, but I want to call out that this is the SIG Architecture Special Interest Group. Today is Thursday, September 12th, 2019, and the agenda is available at bit.ly/sig-architecture if you want to follow along after the fact. We have a full agenda today, and we're going to kick it off with Dims discussing the efforts underway to pull things out of Kubernetes. And Dims, you've got the mic.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. So I wanted to kind of brainstorm a little bit about, there are a lot of things that we are trying to kick out. The cloud providers, the CSI migration stuff going on, which will actually help remove the in-tree cloud providers. The credential providers, we need to find a home for. kubectl is getting to staging. We had discussions about Hypercube and Cloud Controller Manager. There's been requests to move things out like the device plugin API, get them to V1 first and then move it out. And yesterday, we were talking about the Kube API server, for example, in SIG API machinery. So the larger question I wanted to ask is, how do we want things to look, say, a year or two down the line? What do we want the end game to be here? Some of these things we are doing for, we want to reduce the size of the binary, for example. And another set of things we do, like we want somebody else to use it without rendering KK, right? So there is a mixture of reasons why we are doing some of these things, but then we need to kind of like think a little bit about where we want to be and see how quickly we can get there from here, right? So I wanted to open this up to everybody. This will also help us figure out what to do in 117 for code organization and try to prioritize things that we think we should do quickly as well. So open floor.
So I guess one of the things I was hoping to get at is sort of prioritization in terms of impact. Some of these feel like they're a bit higher impact than others, and some have some uncertainty, like around Hypercube. What are the use cases that are currently in play that maybe we're not aware of? So I feel like we have a two-pronged thing here. Is what are the uses, and what do we need to do in terms of deprecation around those things to do it responsibly? And then the other is, in terms of impacting the sort of vectors that you mentioned, what's the highest priority to do that? I see those as sort of the two precursors to getting to that answer.
Now, to be clear, not all impacts are going to be felt by consumers downstream. For instance, if you look at something like taking the Kube API server, Kube Controller Manager, it's a strictly code organization effort for improving the daily lives of the developers who work on it, right? Being able to express, I depend on this and not on that, is something that staging is exceptionally good at. I can accept that something like Hypercube does have an end user impact and would be assessed perhaps differently.
Right. One of the reasons for bringing up Hypercube was that it's traditionally lacked owners and there was nobody taking care of it. This is almost, beating the bushes to get people out to actually own stuff. And we might not even have to deprecate it as long as we make Hypercube available to a team to maintain it outside of. So that's a slightly different thing. But then I also want to check, is there anything else people think that is important that is not on the list right now as well?
That's a lot of stuff. It's hard for me to figure out prioritization because I think different parties will have different vested interests. Like me personally, I've had a vested interest from a SIG cluster lifecycle perspective on rationalizing the cloud providers to be all out of tree because the installation story is fragmented. And if you try to help people along the way, they get more confused than they would be otherwise. So I think it depends highly upon not just what SIG Arch wants, but who are the people who are going to show up to do the work. I think what one of the things I want to talk about later, and I think this relates to this topic too as well, is who in the community wants some of these goals, and how do we prioritize the people that are going to show up? How do we incentivize people to show up and help do the work?
Yeah, I think some is going to come naturally, right? Like, so I have a personal vested interest in, say, Kube API server, right? So I may not go in and try to muck with a cloud provider that I'm not particularly familiar with, but I am familiar with a Kube API server, and I can describe how to do that. So I don't think the people who would do this are fungible. I think that it is more likely to end up in restrictions on review time, where someone who is heavily impacted by one of these wants to help with a move, but they have to find a cooperative reviewer to review moves as things start to move into staging. So are you asking about the first or the second? Reviewers or doers?
I have a meta comment, which is it really architecture's job to very carefully prioritize these things? I would kind of more expect something along the lines of SIG architecture sets a cap on how much disruption we can survive in a given release, and it should be up to the relevant owners of these various things how important they are. Does that make sense?
I think this came up because Hypercube came up. And if you start moving things like a cloud controller manager and a Kube API server into staging, the future of Hypercube becomes more and more in question.
Agree, and I'd like to see things like Kube Proxy even move out of the core of it and move into either staging or an entirely separate repo. Along with, my main motivator for Kube Proxy is I don't want people to keep adding to things like Kube Proxy. I want them to fork it and make their own. And it's very difficult to do that right now because it's too entangled. So we've done this process before, we need to do it again. But also because I think something like Kube Proxy should have its own suite of end-to-end tests, which shouldn't really be part of the regular Kubernetes suite. I can exercise Kube Proxy better in isolation than I can literally end-to-end.
So Tim, this is Derek.
Service API and everything move along with it?
No, the Service API is part of Kubernetes. Kube Proxy is an implementation of the Service API.
Okay.
So Tim, this is Derek. I guess I'm somewhat in agreement with Daniel though on like what is the disruption budget to a project in a given time window. And if everyone's disrupting everything, that's probably not a desired end state, or maybe it is. I'm curious on others' perspectives. But
that's fine, but what do you mean by disruption here? Like within the purvey of SIG network, if I decide I want to move Kube Proxy into staging, it shouldn't disrupt anybody except maybe release as we figure out how those pieces are going to fit together.
And everybody whose PRs you cause a bunch of rebases.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Yeah. Kubectl actually did that, right? Kubectl started doing the stuff, and then we all lined up to do the whatever reviews and whatever changes in packaging that needed to be done at that point.
Right. So I think it's a reasonable thing to say SIG Arch, if it's a problem, if this is causing churn for people who aren't interested in that churn, then maybe SIG Arch is the buck stops here. But within the purvey of SIGs, I think we should just provide guidance and encouragement.
How much of a problem has it been? Like, I know there are 1,000 PRs open, but many of them probably should be closed.
Yeah, I mean, if the churn is to the PRs that are open, I don't actually care about that. Like, I don't think that's really that huge of a deal, at least in my corner of the world.
yeah, so more Tim, I was wondering what Daniel viewed as disruptive.
Okay.
Like to me, disruptive would mean makes our EDE suites no longer functional, makes like I guess I'm curious on Daniel perspectives on disruption, but I have lived through many disruptions, both downstream of Kubernetes and upstream, and can realize that like the term has many different meanings. So maybe quantifying disruption budgets would be useful.
Yeah, and I think more than just what the budget is, I think just recognizing that there's different groups of people that different changes might disrupt. Like there's end users, so which kube control, making substantial changes to kube control would disrupt end users. There's cluster operators, changes to
Hypercube or how cloud controller managers run
changes for
disrupt operators.
their user surface, but I don't think that's really what we're talking about.
But when I talk about disruption here, I'm talking about generates extra work for various groups of people just so that they can remain in the same place that they started out in, right? Like if you change how you operate a binary, like that means the cluster lifecycle has to change, the cloud providers all have to change. Like that's genuine work, and it makes Kubernetes harder to use than maybe it needs to be.
So I think there's maybe two grades of change we're talking about here. One is simply I'm moving the code from one place to another, but nothing actually changes from the user's point of view. The other is I'm taking Cloud Controller Manager and I'm busting it out of the Controller Manager, and I'm introducing a lot of new.
Yeah, I didn't get to the last group, which I think is also important, and we shouldn't forget them, which is us. Like moving code around actually disrupts programmers and everybody's mental model of where everything is and how it works. That's not a zero cost.
I think that the biggest one for cluster admins that we've been considering so far has been, what is the future of Hypercube? And maybe that would be the most constructive to discuss here. I look at it and I say that we have lots of different processes included in Hypercube. When we first started and everything was definitely going to live in one repo, it made a lot of sense. But if you listen to what, say, Tim said right here, where he was, maybe I want to move Kube proxy out of KK entirely. Would that also mean being removed from Hypercube? And if so, we start saying Hypercube is no longer one-stop shopping. And I believe different, but
that moving the code in or out of this repo should have any effect of what actually ends up in a binary in the end.
Not necessarily.
It's not the code location that matters. It's the implication that, hey, this thing is a replaceable component. It's not part of the necessarily recommended way to run.
Hypercube says I want an all-in-one stop shop.
Yeah, if we're saying
Kubernetes, it can vendor in that code from that repo, and
but by moving the code, we're saying like this isn't part.
Sure. The only things that have not been replaceable so far pretty much are API server and controller manager, the scheduler, Kube proxy. Like these things have been replaced.
I don't think that bundling them into Hypercube means they're not replaceable, and I don't think moving them into a separate repo means they're not replaceable. Hypercube is a umbrella project that says, look, if you conform to this API, I can link you in as a meta binary. And I don't care whether you live in KK or some other repo or some vendor place or third party. This is the API.
Yeah,
right?
for example, you could take all the Hypercube stuff and move it out of the main repo and have it pull stuff in.
So I think this is the point here. If somebody, let's say, so today we're absent and real owner of Hypercube, right? But let's say somebody steps up and says, I want to drive this thing because I think it's a fun and interesting project. I do. I just don't have enough hours in the day. And they want to move Hypercube out. There's a practical problem, which is vendoring in from KK is a disaster, right? So you can't vendor in scheduler and Kubernetes.
You can, just you're not going to have a good time.
Yeah, so I can say I've done it before. I've vendored a lot. I can also say that when you look at, say, Hypercube in particular, it is not an aggregator of meta APIs. It is something that says I need every single thing that I depend on here to agree on every single level of every transitive dependency it has in order for me to build it and create it.
Just to do anymore with modules.
Tim's had his hand up, and then Dim's as well. So if we can give him the floor for a second.
We've gone from meta, and I wanted to go back to another meta question, which is, if we don't have owners and maintainers for these things, is it in the best interest of the community to kind of limp it along in this state when we have known workarounds that a person could create their own Hypercube if they wish to do so? So if the community doesn't have resources to maintain it in earnest, is it in the best interest of the project to continue to publish this thing, even though that there are issues that crop up along the way over time?
I think that's sorry, go ahead, please.
Good question. So the thing here is for the Hypercube, right? It's like the tip of the iceberg. We have to get that out first before we can move, the other things. But then if we take it out and people don't actually form a team and it bit rots, it doesn't really affect the rest of the things that we do in KK. But if there is a good set of owners and they end up writing a good contract that we can, use for all the things that need to be rendered, then it becomes good for both Hypercube as well as, the people that are working on KK. A similar problem we have with Docker Shim, right? There's a lot of people who are not using Docker, especially the cloud providers who have, like GKE, for example, right? Cloud providers like that who don't use Docker, right? But then we have to ship a default one, and currently it is Docker Shim. And we try to do the best we can with Docker Shim, but there's not really too many people who want to spend time on Docker Shim at this point. And if there are, then they would be working on moving the Docker Shim out as a CRI. So, and we are carrying the burden, but, and we are not getting any help. So that is that is a strain on the project resources as well.
So maybe we've identified a couple of things. One is we kind of are strained on resources right now. And it kind of gets into this, maybe another meta question of is there a way to get more resources involved to help with some of these areas? And then maybe a second is a criteria if we want to break something out is we have to have a list of names of people who will sign up to be maintainers before it can be broken out of KK. I mean, that could be a criteria in the code organization. You've got to have so many sets of owners. And then we say, okay, now it can be considered. Because otherwise it needs the support structure of the rest of it because there's a lot of users. And I see a hand up.
So housekeeping thing real quick. We're not going to resolve this probably if we spend the rest of the meeting on it. So can we maybe limit discussion to the next 5 minutes and move on because we have a very full agenda. Is that okay with everybody? So we had Valerie and I couldn't see whose hand that was in the other room, but
That was me.
Okay, so Valerie and then John.
I'm not clear on why necessarily why bit rot is a binary issue if we take it out of tree.
Oh, okay, I raised that so I can answer that, Valerie. So the thing is, when we take Hypercube out, right, and we start making changes in KK, and we are not able to vendor it in properly, like I think David was mentioning, because the dependencies, or even like if you look at the POC that I posted, I just have like a couple of Go files and the rest of the things are coming from KK. But then if the signature of some of the methods in KK changes and nobody's keeping track of those changes and mirroring whatever needs to be changed in Hypercube, over a period of time, you will no longer be able to have a single Go file. You will have to either copy files or make modifications and things like that. So that's the bit rot part.
Yeah, if I could comment on that as well. Like, I think actually separating them out is exactly what we need to do to prevent things that are important from rotting. If it's all in the big bucket of, oh, the Kubernetes guys and ladies, they'll all maintain that, then these people who care about that one small slice aren't going to take their time to do it. But once it's separated out, they don't have a choice. Or they decide they don't actually care about it, and they go on and use something else.
Yeah, I think sometimes disruptive change is a hammer that has to be used in cases where, especially where awareness is hard to get. And I think the cluster operators are notoriously hard for us to reach. So, for better or for worse, this may be a method through which we can elevate the risk associated with bit rot on that too. So let's say that if there's going to be more conversation on this, that we move it to the mailing list, if that's okay with everybody.
Can somebody volunteer to start a thread with a summary?
Yeah, I think I signed myself up, right?
Sorry, Dims. Definitely.
Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Next up is from Tim. So you got
so this theme that Tim seems to have started even without us coordinating, which is interesting, is the same theme. Is that I wanted to put out a call for help or for more folks to engage. But the question is, how do I do that within SIG Arch, and how do I do that broader within the community? I wanted to make sure that we're kind of mindful of, we have all these efforts ongoing, right? And I want to make sure that I want to make impact with the right audience and also with the community, and making sure we're doing the right thing. There's a lot of PRs that have languished on the backlog for conformance. We have a group of what I can best describe as people who care about this but are part-timers, right? So it's not their full-time effort to see this engagement through all the way. So as a result, there's a lot of languished things that go on and a lot of fits and starts. I guess we need to ruminate on it, but the broader problem is we need people who are devoted to this, that can see through some of these issues along the way and help shepherd folks like Hippie as he tries to make sense of the universe from the external viewpoint, right?
So this is partially a resourcing thing, and that, as we know, we're all bottlenecked on top-level reviewers. Is there a way to, like, is the API review process is done, to maybe do some sort of shepherding of new people into this process so that we can cultivate new folks? Is that something reasonable?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. We've done a little bit of that, but it's slow going, like Jim said. So I mean, I can certainly take on more to try and bring more people on board with that, because that is definitely one of my focuses. It's you know, I definitely want to make more progress with it. So I have somebody here to help out with some of the automation around the test writing, not automation around the project board and things like that we've talked about in the past. What we could try to do is see if we can drum up interest and sort of more formalize it like we have with API review. I guess that might be helpful.
But yeah, I do have to say about the conformance test. Specifically, one challenge we've had is that there's a lot of subtlety and detail, both in terms of the functionality that needs to be covered and how the tests are written. So getting some of the test changes through was quite painful and took many iterations. And that's one reason why some of the PRs may appear to be languishing, is because it's actually hard to get the issues addressed adequately.
Is it an issue of we don't have patterns or frameworks for doing it right, or is it an issue of you can't get people like myself to review?
You can't get people like you to write them, I think, is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there'll be subtle things in the test that just need revision. We've had Hippie and his team, as well as some other folks, doing a lot of work to write tests, but sometimes there'll be things like there was one with pod template. It's like, hey, we wrote a test for pod template. It's like, nobody uses that API. We should just deprecate it. So there's a lot of institutional knowledge or tribal knowledge that's, I think, as people start to try and write these tests, surfaces.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, like, every time I've gone to final approval, I'd say 50% of them, there's something subtle that I feel like is important to flag before merging. And it's things like something that requires privileged access, something that forces the conformance tests to not run as a user, but run as an admin, things that not all tenanted distributions might run, things that imply optional features that we have to go negotiate with other vendors. So it's, the first phase of it has definitely been somewhat, we need to get the process in place. I still think we're at risk of the process is still very complex.
So part of my goal, like personally in that program, is to work on, like Tim was saying, making a set of processes and functions that can make the generating simpler, or generating the tests easier, and building out those tests easier. But I think that for the deeper questions, I don't necessarily have an answer at this point of like, like what Clayton's talking about here.
Yeah, or just as one example, someone wrote resource quota tests, which was fine. We didn't have any tests for resource quota, except some of the resources that were being tested, we didn't have any other conformance tests for, and it wasn't clear that we should add them, like implicitly require them as part of conformance, just accidentally as part of those tests, right? So it is a complex surface area, or changes to the networking tests to make them work on Windows, made them not do what they were doing anymore, what they were like supposed to be doing. So there are all kinds of subtleties that surface through the test where someone wants to get a result from a container that's running, and they do it by accessing some incidental API that actually wasn't previously covered by conformance. So we're still at such an early stage that we encounter that almost in every test.
I'd say the thing is definitely not great, but the hard part of this is not the tooling. The hard part is the domain knowledge.
Yeah.
So
one of the
Hippie
we're
had
trying
us
to
in.
help with
Sorry for a while.
is that when we encounter this tribal knowledge, we try to capture it. So when we get pushback on a ticket and have to close it, we try to go find the right place and update the documentation. Because out of the team, when we put together the work, the output either needs to be the test getting written, accepted, promoted, or we write documentation to improve the process. And that long list I just heard, I think it was from Clayton, on all of the things that we've hit. It would be lovely to ensure, I'll try to go back and on the recording list that and make sure that stuff is clearly documented so that when other people follow the path we're on, it'll be a lot easier.
It's half past. I'd say we move on. And Hibby, thank you for taking that as an action item, because I do believe the documentation is part of how we dig ourselves out of this. It's just time consuming. So, Tim, do you feel adequately covered on this topic so far?
I think from what we can do now, yes. I think as a community, we need to figure out how to basically call to arms or call to actions a little bit better systematically across the board.
Agreed.
And
okay.
So,
great.
I'm
Thank you.
sorry about that for SIG Network, call to arms.
Valerie, you have the next agenda item, discuss Kubernetes personas and the relative priorities. Can you time box this to say maybe 10 minutes? Is that?
Definitely, yes.
Okay, thanks.
So this is an issue that came up recently. There was a big kerfuffle on the mailing list around SIG CLI. Do they want to remove kubectl CT or not? And one of the big points in that is it's a very large maintenance burden for the SIG to implement properly. And that kind of raises the question that we don't really have a clear rubric of what kind of personas we are prioritizing, including to what extent we prioritize KK development above the user feature. And this is something that I think, especially at this stage in the project, we might want to have more of a standard on. Like, obviously this is specifically a SIG CLI decision, but this is, I think, a theme that we're going to see more and more of.
Another, and an analogy I might add to this point is there's an ownership question. So SIG CLI owns this code, and in other open source communities, depending on their various strictness and how many participants, like Linux, for instance, if there's no maintainer, that code sometimes gets removed. Whereas we do not have an equivalent. This is maybe the first of the examples in Kubernetes where the SIG doesn't want to spend the time on something that they don't consider as important as their other jobs. And everybody else says that, no, it's important, but is that how ownership works in Kubernetes? So it is a very important question, and I'm glad that we're raising it.
So I'm the person who brought up the personas thing on the list, and who the users are. And some of this comes down to, and I referenced Helm there, because a while ago we kind of had some discussions about that, of who is the target, right? How do you prioritize different users? And one of the things that we came to is the people who develop on it were a lower priority than several defined roles who were using it. So we were willing to take on a much higher burden in order to satisfy their needs, right? And so Kubernetes is used in many places. how do we look at that? If we're maintainers of things, do we want to take on a higher burden, or is the goal to ease our burden, even if it has an impact on end users who may not be happy with it? How do we compare those? How do we prioritize those different roles? And I'm not here suggesting which ones you should prioritize, but I think it's a conversation worth happening and documenting and capturing.
You know, an interesting thought that I had while this conversation was going on, like I'm kind of, I understand the security risk, and I had talked to a few of the people, and I kind of agree that it's a much worse security risk than code, and it's useful, but it's not useful to justify the cost. There was an interesting, from my perspective, is not a single person in that thread volunteered to step up and take ownership of every security related bug in Kube Control CP in order to keep that code in the code base. No one. Instead, a bunch of people were like, no, you can't remove this. But so from an ownership perspective, and I'm not, there's nothing wrong with this. And I actually think, Matt, like your point about on the Helm side, you said we. So the maintainers decided to keep that there. I think there was an interesting thing, which is the maintainers, the we here is SIG CLI, not everybody else who chimed in. And if someone wants to get involved, that really strengthens the argument. But I don't think it's fair, or maybe fair is the wrong word. It's interesting that a bunch of other people who don't work on this code day to day stepped up and said, no, you can't remove this, versus the opposite.
There's like a mental health thing where it's like, would you treat other people the same way you treat yourself inside your own head? It kind of applies here. Like, would we treat other people the same way we treat ourselves as developers on this project?
Valerie? I think you've had your hand raised for a minute.
Sorry, I changed my mind.
You know,
I'll comment on it. So I actually took a look at the code when the thread was raised, and since that code was added at the very beginning, it had to-dos to solve some fundamental problems that still have not been solved. So for that specific issue, I think ownership is an important question, and the personas are an important question, but maybe not the primary ones in this case, because I still haven't heard a proposal to how to solve the fundamental problems which have existed since the command was introduced, which is you're like executing an unvetted binary in a container that may or may not be what you expect it to be.
I had my hand up, but I'll cede to Valerie and Matt first.
Yeah, I raised this because this was kind of a tipping point, but I very much agree, Brian, like this is a very clear-cut case, but I'm starting to see this as a bit of a theme in the project, and I'd rather that we get ahead of the theme before it gets us.
Well, and I would add, I'm sorry about interrupting, Jace, did you want to go?
Matt actually also just ended up, but I think you're going to reply, so I think that's important, if that's okay.
Go ahead and reply.
A really interesting part is part of the reason that people are not wanting to remove this is because I bet every single person who is looking at that as a user who is like, if they remove this, it will never come back and it'll never get done. And so there's an implicit, unstated, like Kube it takes a long time to get things into Kube. If something comes out, it's never coming back in. And I think that drives a little bit of the conversation of there's all that, maybe not exhaustion, but we're all kind of looking at that going, ugh.
Yeah, but I think there's kind of two things in my mind here. One is, irregardless of this issue, looking at who the people are, right? Who are the roles that are involved in this and what do they need? It's a user experience thing. This issue kind of brings it to the surface, but this isn't the only place this arises. Quite often when we're creating things, we look at what do I want, what do I need? And we're not necessarily thinking of who those end users are. And if we actually start to think about them, look at them, research them, understand them, and maybe even prioritize them, then it's easier to make trade-offs, it's easier to make design decisions, and things of that nature. So as a whole, I think this is useful. I think where part of this, at least with kubectl, really spiked it for me was when there was the idea of getting an exception to go around the deprecation policy to shorten it, which puts the removal of it in the holiday season when everybody's scrambling and debugging things. And is stuff like that worthwhile? Is it that much of a priority difference in who the users are and what they need in order to drive something like that? I think that's at least where it spiked it for me in this case, because it's now saying this is such a high priority for this class of users to get out that we want to be disruptive outside of our normal processes to get an exception. And that's when I really started to think about, well, who are the roles and how are they impacted and how do we even think about those?
So housekeeping thing real quick. We've got a lot of people with hands up. We've got basically 1 minute that we committed to for this. So if we're going to move to the next few opinions or hands, whatever that is, then we should extend this and we'll cut down time on the other things. So I want to make a conscious decision about that. Do we want to continue this documentation or this discussion past the 40-minute mark? Yeses verbally or no's?
I'd like to talk a few more minutes about it if we can.
Yeah, let's
Okay.
continue.
Okay, let's give it another 10 minutes. And sorry, Hippie Hacker, that's going to cut down on your time. So Derek, you had your hand up, and then Valerie, and then Clayton.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So I think it's inevitable that we may have made mistakes in the past by making code declared a beta or GA state. The lesson I would like us to take away from here is that, like, thinking back to John's discussion on graduation criteria, like Brian's comment on reading that code and seeing a number of to-dos, like maybe that needs to be a blocker to graduation. And if some of these to-dos were accounted for, how can we avoid finding ourselves in this state a year from now in the project for a new function we add? But I think on the human level, going back to Daniel's comment, like I do not want to be perceived as abusive to maintainers to like not be comfortable in saying, hey, we messed up and the only appropriate way to fix this is to, deprecate. But I think we have to raise the bar for ourselves in the future that we don't graduate stuff if there are a number of to-dos as we go through there. And I think the rush to get your feature into Cube has often been too strong, which is a risk that I see us carrying in the future if we don't raise the bar on graduation criteria.
Valerie?
So this is like, I'm one of the co-chairs of the new SIG Usability. This is one of the things that we're kind of trying to look at is how do we possibly, from like a governance organization view, figure out how to balance things like reliability and developer sustainability and like giving the users the fire hose of features that they want. I think that getting into like what our order of priorities is here is maybe counterproductive, but I'm curious as to what folks think about is the best venue to decide this, because it's going to be a fairly long and complicated discussion.
Just from an administrative standpoint, we have a value as a SIG to move those to our mailing list. And if it's cross SIG, then there's both SIGs get included on the mailing list. Because it's not inclusive for folks that can't make the meeting time. So if we can do that, that would be a great thing to do. Clayton and then Matt.
Yeah, I do think in terms of long-term sustainability, the ultimate goal is that people have to maintain and own code, and ownership comes with responsibility. And we have in this project delegated responsibility to our owners and maintainers with a set of checks and balances from outside that is advisory and in the best interests of the community and the project and the users. But maybe this is a good opportunity for us to restate or to reclarify in a thread or something along like on the mailing list. When we have these tensions, do we delegate and allow the SIGs to make the right decision for themselves, even if there is disagreement about how it impacts users? This is a really tough one because we've taken a very strong stance towards backwards compatibility. It's one of the things that makes this a sustainable platform for our users. But I think about things like the security issue in Kubelet around volume mount paths. That took about 6 months and at least 10 people to get resolved with tens or more than that of fixes. If we can't we kept that because that was such a fundamental function to the project. If we can't come up with ways of saying, you know what, occasionally something that we merge into the duel of derricks, we might put something to GA that just isn't GA quality. We have to have a process that begins to recognize that without saying the people who are currently maintainers must drive this to conclusion. We're forcing you to own this.
Matt? And big +1, by the way, on that.
Yeah, with Cron Job, which is not GA yet, we were talking about it recently because it's along the same lines. It's not ready. We can't just GA the current code that's there, even if we like the API. But there's a lot of people using it. It's not GA. It's not released. It's not the door, and it's widely used in production. And we noticed it because some of us ran into an issue that's in 1.14 right now with cron jobs that hasn't been backported from 1.15 and put in a release yet, and we ran into problems. And we're thinking, well, it's not GA. Why should anybody care? But then there's all these businesses and organizations built on it, even though we haven't shared that. And so this kind of gets into that tug between what we expect and what we've put out, and then how people have taken it and gone and used it and how we're supporting it. And I don't know the answer there, but I see this cropping up in more and more places. And then entirely separate from that, we do have problems of enough maintainers. And this puts in my mind, how can we build more of them? I've seen time and time again where we've dropped the ball in building more maintainers and more contributors. And I'm wondering what we can do different and get out there to correct that, because we need more people.
We got 5 more minutes allocated to this. And it looks like, Tim, you have your hand up?
I've got mine up. I've had it in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, David. So David and then Tim.
Yeah. So I'll note one thing about this. This is available for anyone to maintain. It is difficult for you to force someone to maintain a thing that they aren't interested in maintaining or don't believe has a future. And if we can't find a maintainer, and this was on the mailing list, and as Clayton noted, no one said, I want this feature so badly, I will maintain it. We had said since the beginning of the project, we don't really want drive-bys. And what we have here is a feature that may not function as well as we expect. And given a choice between picking up someone else's work that you can look at and say, I don't think this has a future, and comparing that against the responsible thing that I can do here is admit that this doesn't have a future, notify the community that it doesn't have a future, send out an email so that I can find someone to volunteer, and nobody did. I think we're left looking at it as owners saying, you know, we asked, we told people what was going to happen, nobody came up to finish it, nobody finished it to begin with. I think we should consider stepping away from it.
There's a little bit of back and forth in the chat window that won't make it to the video. Just to raise those issues real quick is really just thinking that maybe our reach isn't big enough to necessarily to assure that all the voices that are stakeholders are being hit. So that goes back to the personas discussion as well. So Tim.
I agree with what David just said, frankly. To the point of the cron job example, this one weighs on me because I didn't even realize cron job isn't GA yet. I've told users to use it. I've told customers to use it because it solves a real problem that they really have and have had for literally years. And as such, without, absent a solution, this is it. I think, early on in the project, we went out of our way to make sure that people who used beta features knew they were using beta features, right? And we put, back when we used annotations as fields, we put the word beta in the dang annotation so that people would see every time they used it that they were using beta. And I guess beta strictly is in the kind of the, or the API group of the cron job, but nobody sees that. That's cargo cult galore. Have we made it too easy for people to use beta features accidentally? Maybe we need to go back and revisit this, try to find a different way to put it in people's face without carrying the burden on the back end like we had to do with all the annotations and stuff. Or Alternatively, maybe we need to take a different approach towards pre-GA features, which is let's just not merge them. Like the Linux kernel doesn't have alpha, beta, GA. It has things that are merged and things that are not merged. And if people want them, they're free to take a patch off of somebody else's tree and build it. And if I'm a vendor and I want to ship that thing, if I'm Red Hat or Ubuntu or whomever, I can take that patch, I can build it in my kernel, I can volunteer to support it, but it's not part of the official project. Like maybe we need to consider something bigger like this. So especially if these life cycles are going to last.
So if I can say, I created an issue around the graduation criteria, alpha, beta, GA in community repo or something. Maybe go start a discussion there on that, because that's a huge topic.
Clayton, then Valerie.
Yeah, I don't want to, and this comment may sound negative, but it's actually more like I'm just trying to be pragmatic. We say we want to grow the amount of developers and contributors in the project. I think we have to look with what we have, and what we have is a large number of critical functions that have to be supported with a slightly growing set of maintainers. I don't think it's unrealistic to expect a large influx of new people who are just going to magically step up. Not that we should stop those efforts or anything, but we have to make the pragmatic decisions as we go, which is when we cannot maintain the features we have to give, I believe the right thing to do is to delegate as much responsibility as possible to the SIG while keeping a set of consistent projects that at least notifies users. I do feel that some of if there's nobody who can maintain components, there has to be that possibility that they're going to be deprecated unless an owner steps up and communicating that.
Valerie, do you want to wrap us up on this, and then we'll move over to Hippie Hacker?
Yeah, as someone who helps maintain patched versions, I think that would be way too inaccessible as a way to gate things, especially if you use a vendor and literally can't. But I would like to see way more in your face and way more explicit gating for features, definitely in some format, because like I use cron jobs. I have never hit the API manually and never noticed their beta. That kind of thing is just so easy, even the alpha stage, to kind of adopt. And I would like there to be more of a danger sign for folks.
At least alphas are off by default. Betas being on by default means people are going to use them, right? And they become, and if they sit in beta for more than one release, they become de facto GA.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's go ahead and give the last 9 minutes to Hippie Hacker and the discussion around that. And I'm sorry that it got pushed out so far.
That is all right. I'll try to be quick. There's 3 main points I want to cover. One of them is we've been asking for how are we doing with regards to pod spec. Pod spec has 34 fields, and we initially found there was a bunch of unhit fields in our test suites, and I suggested we look at those, only to find out they were alpha. It wasn't clearly marked. I had to go, it's documented, but you had to know to look in the documentation for those fields, and we wrote some things to capture that. I'm wondering if it's something that we could mark somehow in the Open API spec or later. The same with deprecated. Deprecated is available in Open API v3. We do that by looking for uppercase or lowercase the word deprecated. Gated is similar to release, in that we have about 8 regular expressions we use to find if a field is gated. I think it's almost possible for us to specify which gate corresponds to which field. In this list, if we pull out the alpha and betas, we've already prioritized the fields that are completely untested or don't have conformance tests. And it's probably up to us to look and decide what field kind we wanted to send down, or which field. Container's been voted highly, so it's definitely hit multiple times, as well as volume. This is that report. We might stop for a moment if there's any comment, and then I'll go on to the next one.
To API machinery folks, I'm looking at Daniel in the room, is there a cap around a real IDL? I know we've been talking about it forever. Is there a cap?
I just posted the issue number to the chat.
It is a cap?
You're talking about field gates?
I'm talking about a proper IDL that lets us document these things in more than regular expressions and comments.
I think that's a drastically larger issue.
So no, there's not a cap for that.
There's not a cap. No, there's not a cap.
So I just discussed, because of the stuff with Hippie, I just discussed this with a few people here, and not an IDL, but the stuff that Hippie's talking about, and I'm hoping to put something out in the next couple of weeks that talks, that tries to be a comprehensive effort. There's actually like 4 or 5 different efforts to do this in different slices, and so there's just no sort of overall arching organizing thing that's prioritized it.
For what it's worth, the comments that we have are a form of IDL.
I mean,
if you're machine readable, really.
No, there are aspects of our comments that are machine readable, and there are aspects that are just human documentation. If you're parsing the human documentation with regex, that's not ideal. You can add an arbitrary number of like plus whatever things at the bottom, and they shouldn't show up in the human readable documentation, and they would be machine parsable. So like, kind of knock yourself out with that.
Right, but we need a policy whereby when people have new fields, there's an explicit, okay, this is an alpha field, and there's some documentation.
Actually doing this is harder than I just described, but I don't think we have the time in this meeting to go into an entire design.
I will just say that I think it's something we need to do, and I've been advocating for a long time.
Okay, maybe we can talk after the meeting.
I think that sounds like enough time on that topic. We can visit more. The other thing is we are both wanting and requiring that we've changed the limit from a cycle to 2 weeks of flake. That's a flake-free and flag-free operation before promoting test conformance, which is great. And but the problem is we can't have those conformance tests marked as GA if the testing it if the endpoints themselves aren't already promoted. So we have this chicken and egg problem that we need to address. We can automate it if we know how to get around it, but that just needs to be discussed.
I don't, have we decided that conformance and GA must go in lockstep? Because it doesn't seem like
yes, I mean, so that, I think there's a very easy way around this, which is you must have end-to-end tests that could be promoted to conformance.
Yeah, you should have that.
You should have that, and those tests should be flake-free, and then they can get promoted to conformance.
Yeah, and that's how we're doing it. The issue, I don't know that we need to go into detail here. The issue Jordan had during the webhook and stuff was partly that privileges issue, but also if we're to automate it, then those can't be 2 separate PRs where you trigger the automation that you must have conformance tests for GA and the promotion to GA of those tests. So this is really a question around automation and how we solve it. There's not enough time to really.
Yeah, I was thinking more in terms of somebody's a vendor. They're operating Kubernetes for people. Is it really fair to them to make a feature go stable and required in the same release? Like, I would kind of expect it to be stable and optional for a release to give people time to actually roll it out and then become required.
Okay, maybe we should do this on the mailing list.
It may be that the 2 week flake-free needs to revert to a cycle just so that we can have what you're saying, have it out in front of the world before we force conformance in the next cycle. Let's move that to the mailing list, if that's okay. The last one is we're trying to mark tests as disruptive as well as conformance. We've hit a point where we promoted something that we need to be able to evict stuff, which is disruptive, and it should go everywhere. How do we do that together? Sonoboy caught that, by the way.
Yeah, I thank you for raising that. I don't know that we have time to address it. I think that we're going to need, there's other things like around certain types of workloads eventually that might need to run on certain types of nodes. There's privilege issues. We had that whole profile discussion. There's probably some privileges or some expectations we have to give to people running these tests so that they can make them safe in their environment.
I just have a logistical question, which is
Did these already get discussed in the conformance subproject meetings? Or on the mailing list, like our normal policy is to discuss it somewhere else first?
Some of these did, but yeah, probably we should be having in the some project, but I think this last one, I'm not sure if this last one did. So we probably should do that.
I think we're good on that. So that's going to wind up in the maybe a CC to the top level mailing list, but certainly in the conformance working group. And I guess that brings us to the hour. Thank you everyone for showing up and participating and having a really good discussion here. And don't forget our mailing list is available to you 24/7 to talk about these things. So, all right, thanks everybody.
Thanks, Jason.
Yep.
Thanks, Paul.